Now let's welcome the next keynote speaker. Raimund Bleischwitz is the director of the UCL Butler School of Environment, Energy, and Resources, and the chair in Sustainable Global Resources at the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources. He has also many collaborations with Chinese institutions. He is the PI of an international collaboration project on the circular economy and resources efficiency with a special focus on China. In January 2022, he will become the scientific director of the Leibniz Center for Tropical Marine Research at Germany. So I have to say Raimund's leaving is a big loss for the UCL. Raimund, can you hear me? If you are ready, you can start.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
That's wonderful. So thank you first, Zifumi, for the invitation for hosting this entire excellent event, and indeed also for your kind words. I would also like to thank Demaris for her really fresh and somewhat thought-provoking speech addressing the important issues of climate justice, the role of economics, but also the potential role of nuclear energy. And I would also like to thank indeed Christoph Lindner, our Dean, and Yiming Wei from the Beijing Institute of Technology for the words of welcome. Demaris and all participants here, I do think that a discussion about nuclear energy is really important and overdue. However, what I would like to do with you is to also invite you to follow me on alternative thoughts of how the issues of overusing environmental space and resources and climate justice can be addressed by what I will be addressing now, which is a circular economy. And as Mi has mentioned, I'm working on the topic since a couple of years. I'm collaborating with a number of excellent scholars in China, but also Chinese scholars working in the UK, like Ming Yang, on the topic. And I would really like to invite you looking at the issue together with the challenge of decarbonization our economies. Bear with me just for a second now while I'm trying to upload my slides, which I hopefully can do with ease. Oops, sorry, that was the wrong one. Let me just, nope, sorry. So it now should come on the screen. It's being uploaded. So the point I wanted to make at the beginning, and you will hopefully see it in a second on your screens, is that the circular economy is pretty important. The uploading takes obviously a second longer than I anticipated. So the first point I wanted to make, and let me just check my internet connection, which should be good. All right, reloading the Thunder. Is it now on the screen? Probably not yet, right? Now it should be coming. It's whoa. Why does it take ages to open the slides? They're on my screen, but of course there's a distance. Okay, let me make the first point without the slide, and that is the relevance of a circular economy for decarbonization efforts. I think there is no doubt that reducing the CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions are important. And it was fantastic to see the pledge to net zero carbon in China for the year 2060 being made in the last year, and the Glasgow COP discussions a few weeks ago. What is important to realize, though, is that the more you move down the road towards decarbonization, the more you also have to go beyond energy, isn't it? Energy is an important part of the game, but at the same time, we also have to see what end users and sectors are contributing to the demand, are the drivers for the demand for energy, and then you all of a sudden have the role of other industrial sectors, the role of society, and come up with an accounting that actually in countries like China, roughly 2/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions are contributed beyond the energy system, which is why we'll have to look at transportation, obviously, at the resource-intensive core industries, and at the role of the built environment. And that is exactly what is also addressed by a circular economy. It's still uploading, which and the point I then would like to make together with you is that the circular economy in China is an established policy area. And I will walk with you through the stages, the success factors, as I see it, of a circular economy in China, and some of the limitations that I think are more than ever important to address, and that could also benefit from some insight that we have learned over the policy evaluations. It's not preparing my slides. Okay, can you see it now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, and it's also
Yes,
like on the full screen. Okay, that's excellent. Okay, let me just quickly walk forward here. So the first one is indeed about the pandemic and the ways to establish a Build Back Better, a green recovery in light of the CO2 emissions reduction that we could manage at least temporarily. Then indeed, that is a point I mentioned about why China's circular economy strategies matter a lot for the climate strategies too. Here's a slide that quickly summarizes from a UNEP, International Resource Panel point of view of why circular economy and resource productivity strategies are a cross-cutting, more holistic approach to look at the overuse of resources, and why that indeed would then also contribute to addressing the areas beyond the energy system. And here is a definition on a circular economy that has been put forward by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and by the European Commission and others, which is interesting to read also for economists, because basically it is not just about closing the loops, but maintaining value of materials and product over a lifetime as long as possible, and to contribute to public values. So by adopting the circular economy principles of a more renewable type of economy and maintaining value, we at the same time can start rethinking what the role of economics is in it. And here's the other diagram that has been developed and that gives this beautiful butterfly type of shape with the loops at different scales for different type of products and supply chains. Also here distinguishing between the more biotic part of our economy and the abiotic part. And again, it leads us to look more closely at products, but also supply chains, international trade system, and the like. Okay, that is then really a pledge that I would like to leave with all of us here, that it requires us to be more ambitious and more bold about the role of economics in all of it. Upscaling a subdiscipline, in my view, refers to the role of energy, environmental, and resource economics that quite often, in a way, is narrowly defined. We need to integrate innovation economics. We need to integrate behavioral economics when we look at the challenges ahead that are about the dynamic, the nonlinear, the disruptive changes, the interlinkages across resources, like how much energy do we need to produce materials, how much water do we need to produce energy, and the like, the behavioral changes that are needed, but in particular also, and I was really fascinated to listen to Demaris here, the cumulative gains that would come from co-benefits if health and environmental change are addressed simultaneously, if indoor air pollution is reduced, if the lifetime of buildings, of products is extended. What are the co-benefits and what is the tool of economics available that can help us to understand how it contributes to value added over time? Those cumulative gains are really at the heart of some of the more recent approaches in economics and indeed also in other disciplines. So the long-term view that we need to establish. That would then come with other type of scenarios and indeed also a range of modeling approaches that can be adopted. All right, let's now zoom a bit more into the trends towards circularity. A common misunderstanding is that circularity is about recycling and waste management. That's not the case. It is much wider. And indeed, when we try to measure circularity, we have to also use material flow analysis and input-output tables, about which Zifumi is an expert. And we would then realize that actually the worldwide circularity is currently at relatively low levels. For the EU, it is estimated to be 12%. For the UK, slightly higher. It's been increasing slowly. There have been estimates made also for China. China is estimated to be roughly 6% circular, which is not a surprise given the speed by which China has developed over time. However, the perhaps surprising insight is with data analysis that we did is that China is a champion in the relative decoupling across economies. It has managed to double resource productivity over the last 20 years, even if you look at the wider indicator of the material footprint that also captures the international trade relations and the imports of raw materials and prefabricated products. So compared with Europe, that has been more or less stagnating in resource productivity, this is something that requires us to ask, so why is China so successful on decoupling, and what are the drivers for this relative decoupling in China? And it is here that indeed the circular economy comes into play. While it is relatively recent in Europe, with the circular economy package of the European Union coming up in 2015, and indeed now a new version, it is fair to say that China has a longer tradition that dates back to the early 2000s. It has been doing a circular economy in a comprehensive approach. It addresses also air pollution and water challenges. It is kind of a broader environmental policy approach, but it is mainly done by the National Development Reform Commission, which plays very much into the view that it is an economic concern in China that has been triggering all those policies. So disentangling drivers for a circular economy in China is somewhat difficult for a number of reasons. We're working on it. There is, in our view, a strong driver coming from the energy and resource efficiency in industry. Yes, waste management, recycling plays a role too. And there is also urban ambitions in highly polluted areas. And indeed, the range of programs that have been set up is really impressive. What is perhaps really underlying, and it's not often mentioned in policy document, is the resource dependency of China. When we look at, for instance, the data provided by the Chatham House Resource Trade Database, we see that China is probably the most resource import dependent economy of the world, even more than Europe. The import dependency has been rising over the years despite success in decoupling. And indeed, when you look at geopolitics, there is indeed the tension now with Australia and a number of other countries about, well, lots of things, but they trickle down to questions of iron ore exports, coal exports, etc. And indeed, the implication is that the drivers for a domestic strengthening of a circular economy in China are likely to become even stronger. So looking at the actual 5 years plan, we see a number of higher ambitions for the next years to come on increasing resource productivity even further, on a number of more sectorial activities, on the expected growth of the reuse sector in the economy, which is a strong industrial action type of a program. And recently I've heard that the interlinkages with decarbonizations are really more and more addressed in China. So the real success factor probably is over the years what has been called upscaling, or what has been called experiments under hierarchy. There have been a number of interesting indicators, but the way of how China has managed to upscale the pilot projects, evaluate success factors, and then give them some proper more finding into eco-industrial parks. That is one of the things that probably most in Europe will admire. It is also interesting to see the more recent efforts to restructure or green the existing industrial parks, which are indeed the essential feature for bringing innovation into the Chinese production system, if I'm not mistaken. So this leads us now to a question which I really would like to leave with you, because in all the papers that you see about China, there's a lot about those success factors and cases and how it is measured and indicators. There's little understanding yet, in my perspective, about what limitations exist. And that is something that I find increasingly interesting, because indeed we would hope that more upscaling is really something that just works. So there's evidence for implementation gaps. I've seen a recent PhD that, for instance, looks at failures of eco-industrial parks to deliver. And indeed also we look at the evidence for evaluation schemes existing. There's a bit of a challenge in China to work on enforcement issues, to have litigation processes, and that indeed then leads us to look at what the systems analysis here calls the coordination challenges in China. When I look at how the dissemination works, quite often the success factors are located along the highly industrialized eastern areas. So it is an issue in other provinces, in particular in central China. And indeed, it's also interesting to see the governance approach that offers under the experiments under hierarchy a lot of local flexibility actually, but then the local political economy comes into it, and there is the existing coal industry, resource intensive industry, what is called the zombie industry in China. So in a way you would have a bit water in the wine here. We would also think that China could take advantage of low-hanging fruits in the past, and the question of how it is deployed further and integrated in the system, that is something that requires more research in the future. And that has indeed altogether then implications also for decarbonization in China. I do think that a sort of hidden champion of the circular economy success, and is also evidenced by some excellent research papers on it, is the industrial energy efficiency that has been made. That is something that is like a working horse of the circular economy in the resource-intensive industries in China in the past. It is likely to work also in the future, but we have to really see that this has been one of the major success factors. And the way of how it is progressing matters a lot also for decarbonization. We would also think that there are opportunities for a better waste management system that would then lead to shifting some of the greenhouse gas emissions if, say, energy is turned into heat from like replacing a fossil fuel energy in those extended schemes. There's also the whole notion of the resource-intensive industries that could support industrial decarbonization. I was impressed in a way by recent announcement of Bow Steel, the largest steel producer in the world, that has made their own pledge to net zero carbon. However, they have not or not yet joined the steel club that has been formed at the Glasgow conference. So seeing how steel industry will decarbonize further with what they call the blue hydrogen option will also be one of the interesting things. So the real issue at stake to me here is the deep transition of key foundation industries, the market deployment of how it really works with establishing markets for secondary materials in China, and indeed foresight strategy scenarios that go beyond the 5 years plan. And that is something that I would really like to then take my last minutes here to walk with me through some of the thoughts here. We have done some analysis on steel consumption across the world over the last 100 years. And what you may or may not see here, but the picture in principle shows the saturation of steel demand in all industrialized countries over the years, once the built environment basically has been set up. And where we see China now is at this point of saturation, measured in steel consumption per household, per like income over time, per capita income over time, sorry. So that indicates that we should not use the last 20 years of increasing steel demand and extrapolate it in the future, even with sophisticated kind of statistical tools, but really should take a much wider time frame and a cross-country comparison, accept the idea of some saturation, and then estimate that most likely the steel demand in the future can be expected to flatten in a historical type of analysis. We are using a macroeconomic model of CGE type here. It might not be as famous as the DICE model from William Nordhaus, but we are also doing pretty good work with it. It's been acknowledged by the OECD in their macroeconomic modeling of a circular economy paper. And it really comes with the typical GTAP type of approach with a number of sectors and regions in it. What is interesting is that we really also have worked on a paper of what happens if China shifted to using more secondary steel. And the quick insight is that China would benefit. The rest of the world would benefit from more supply, more green supply becoming available on the market, driving down the prices, having better access then for the majority of developing countries to construction materials, basically, with the exception, of course, for iron ore exporters. And that all would come through these macroeconomic modeling insights. So my view here about justice is that, yes, this is likely to contribute to justice because there are better access opportunities to housing, to roads, to other infrastructure, opportunities to mobility in particular, if there would be a larger availability of a greener steel in the rest of the world, following a shift in China, but potentially also indeed in a number of other countries. I leave that with you. I'm now concluding with a couple of thoughts about what that means for economics as such. I do think that we need to be more up to speed with how we look at policy issues. We should definitely go beyond questions of economic incentives and look at the whole range of the basket of policy options that is available, including the mission-oriented policies that Mariana Mazzucato and others are advocating for. It's also really been very interesting to see the clubs of the committed that are now emerging on issues like steel and cement, but also afforestation, on mobility, bring electric vehicles into the market. So that really reaffirms the point that it is energy economics plus that would need to be invited to join our concerted efforts for mitigating climate action. That also then relates to system thinking of how we look at the systems of manufacturing, of cities, of transportation, land use, the enabling role of ICT, which to me always then is a more multidisciplinary invitation, which should include the entire system of provision, including the end users. And thanks for Zhifu making the nice remarks about my new job. I believe in my current role that a blue economy and blue carbon are becoming more and more important. The ocean is our big friend in a way that kindly has been absorbing some 25% of the carbon emissions in the past, and the ways of how this can be enhanced in the future by growing seagrass, protecting mangroves, etc., is, to me, one of the key contributions that a climate economics can make in the future. I'm stopping here with some concluding thoughts. I hope I could inspire you with a few thoughts of how China has been progressing on the circular economy and what that could also then imply for decarbonization and climate and energy economics. I do think there is also a need to address like the database, the evidence-based for policy and economic analysis. It would be fantastic to have better data that allows a better evaluation, a bit comparable perhaps to what the Europeans have set up at the Community Innovation Survey. So having core indicators for the provinces would indeed be interesting as a way of then doing better research. And indeed, we should also collaborate with our Chinese friends and colleagues and people working on those topics about how we can do more like survey analysis that grasps the attitudes of the real actors on the ground, do some time series, indeed, or continue doing time series at the level of provinces, sectors, to have a more like participatory type of modeling. When I look at urban spaces, system dynamics is interesting, but also all the sort of agent-based modeling and the ways of how the macroeconomic modeling that we tend to do can interact and be soft linked with those more disruptive type of meso-scaled models. And indeed, we just hope that the geopolitical situation allows us to continue with collaborations like this. Thanks again, Ji-Fu-Mi, for making this conference possible. As a last word, there are 5 new centers on a circular economy here in the UK. I think they all, one way or another, collaborate with Chinese scholars. So if you haven't had a chance, please watch the space. And I would certainly also be delighted to collaborate with as many people as possible on those. So thanks a lot. I'm stopping the slide sharing here. Sorry for the hassle in the beginning, and I look forward to any comment you may have.
Many thanks, Raimund. Many thanks for an impressive talk. So circular economy is an effective way to reduce resources, energy, and carbon emissions. So we have time for one question. So any questions?
There's one online from
Oh,
Demar's.
one on the line. Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Demar's.
Hi, thank you. I do have a question actually for Raimund, but I would also just like to begin by thanking him because not only is this an outstanding and very thought-provoking presentation, but also Raimund, you've been a really incredible colleague in the last 3 to 4 years, and it's been terrific working with you as another head of department in the Bartlett, and you were also a very large part of why the campaign to rename the school Sustainable Construction succeeded because you were very content as the head of Bezier to let that go forward. So, Raimund, you have been a silent partner in all of this for quite some time, and I was delighted by your intervention and also the generosity with which you spoke about colleagues' work and particularly the co-mitigation work we're doing. And I'm really regret that you're leaving UCL, but I'm delighted that you're working on saving the oceans because to me that is really the much more difficult challenge in some ways than reducing carbon emissions or methane emissions in the present. So, Godspeed to you. My question really about your talk actually relates to those projections about steel usage, because I agree with you, it seems to have plateaued and may even subject to the use of green steel, to decrease. But what assumptions do you make about the demand for steel to adapt to climate change? Because there is the possibility that actually it will pick up again quite considerably as the need for steel and concrete kicks in to facilitate large-scale adaptation to climate change. If you end up having to move Jakarta or relocate, the Marshall Islanders, then you could see a potential for steel use to really accelerate once again. So could you comment a bit on that?
Oh, yes, indeed. I'll try to make it as quickly as possible. There are a number of reasons to really think that the demand for steel will be increasing to meet the SDGs. And that is partly because all renewable energy options require steel, new energy distribution systems require steel, new electric vehicles, etc. And then what you just have mentioned, if we really need to move cities, oh gosh, that's not the nicest perspective to look for, but it will also require more materials, including more steel. So the question of how we manage this increasing demand for steel is absolutely pivotal. And I myself cannot imagine that we do it alternatively with like wood or other biotic resources. What amount of forests would we need if we wanted to replace cement and steel by wood or other renewable materials. So we really have to work on the greener provision of steel and of concrete. I didn't talk much about concrete here. So in steel, the question then is how much scrap will become available if, for instance, the urban infrastructure in China comes to the end of their lifetime. I understand it starts more or less now because much has been set up in the 90s and is now reaching the point where actually reuse, dismantling, sorting would then come into play. So for the next 10, 20 years, we need better estimates of the anthropogenic stocks and ways of how we can estimate the lifetime, the durability, without like pushing it down. I would not like to see a situation where we would just rebuild and then use like primary production, primary steel to rebuild buildings, but really reuse them, maintain the lifetime as long as possible, still probably having more scrap available across the world than we've had in the last years. So establishing a proper secondary steel route to me is the most promising perspective for steel industry. And that goes a bit beyond what parts of steel industry are propagating, which is like CCS, which might be an option in the future. But for the next 10, 20 years, I would think the secondary option is much more viable. The hydrogen route is super interesting. I understand that some of the German steel manufacturers have a greener version of hydrogen because they can use a byproduct from chemical production and some surplus energy from offshore wind. In China, I understand Bao Steel is looking at byproducts from coke, like using the methane that's provided by coke production, which is again part of like fossil fuel supply. So I would wonder how a life cycle analysis on this option looks like. But these are the sort of trajectories, right? And as you also have done your thought-provoking analysis on nuclear, we also have to live with or have to assess how viable the options are of gas as a transition strategy, of grey hydrogen or blue hydrogen or other options. So there's a fascinating area of research when we look at steel industry, but also other options. And I would be a last person who would say it needs to be fundamentally green, and it can be done the way of how some environmentalists thought they could do it 10, 20 years ago. The circular economy to me is a good concept to study those approaches, and I'm really like there with you and others to continue working on this agenda.
Many thanks for the first question. Many thanks for Raimund answer. Okay, so we will have a coffee break for half hour. So we will return at 11 a.m. London time and 7 p.m. Beijing time. By the way, thank you again for coming in person. So we have a bag for you. There are several face masks in it and sanitizer. So thank you again for coming. Thank you. Yeah, that's